I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Movie Star Magic. And this week we're going to be looking at the illustrious career of Gene Hackman, one of the more fascinating careers I think we've covered on this show. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is break down an actor's career, talk about their career arc, how they've changed as an actor, and then ultimately trying to define what makes them great. What is that singular descriptor, that singular thing, their movie star magic that makes them such a great actor? But this week, we're going to be looking at the career of Gene Hackman. And Gene Hackman was one actor that I've been really excited to dig into because I always love challenges. When we're talking about picking movie stars on the show, I always want to do someone with an interesting career or somebody that has sort of a fascination on my end in regards to how their career went. Either it's strange or should have been bigger, like someone like Diane Lane last week. And when I looked at Gene Hackman, the first thing I thought of was old. Whenever we think of Gene Hackman, he's always this sort of older presence. I don't think I've ever seen a picture of Gene Hackman or a movie of Gene Hackman when he's younger. I really wanted to figure out exactly why that was. So, jumping into it, the first chapter I'm calling The Rebel of a Generation. And when looking into why he was always an older actor, that just stems from the fact that he started later. He wasn't sort of an actor that had a lot of success early on in his career, and he actually didn't have his first big role until 1967's Bonnie and Clyde, in which he was 37. So he's already starting off 37 years old. A couple years into, eventually he'll be into his 40s. So that's the reason why we haven't really seen him as that sort of persona. And I think actually him starting at a later date really does influence our perception of Gene Hackman as a movie star. But 67, starting off with Bonnie and Clyde, and that really, I think, helps understand and shape our understanding of Gene's career, because he starts off in 67 with Bonnie and Clyde, which is sort of seen as the inaugural movie in movie history in terms of the first movie that was sort of the start of the new Hollywood, where we're seeing very new different actors, sort of a revolution of American cinema, particularly in this late 60s into the 70s, where we're getting actors like Dustin Hoffman and Gene Hackman and Al Pacino, sort of unconventional leads starring in movies. We're getting movies that sort of more accurately reflect the times. They're shot on locations. They're a little bit more dark and cynical and nihilistic versus sort of the happy-go-lucky versions, and that was sort of what was really connecting with audiences. And Bonnie and Clyde is the face of that. That's the sort of movie that they'll teach in film school as the start of this period. And he's a part of that. So immediately right out of the gate, he is almost sort of the face of the new Hollywood. He gets nominated for Bonnie and Clyde, then does a couple of other interesting movies. Downhill Racer with Robert Redford in 1970, I Never Sang for My Father. But it's not until 1971 in which he gets his third Oscar nomination and first win for The French Connection, which is a huge, huge deal. That movie wins Best Picture. He's the star of it. He wins for Best Actor. It's a classic kind of new Hollywood, gritty New York, set shot on location, kind of a new Hollywood film. And he's the face of that. So really why I call this chapter The Rebel of a Generation is because right from the beginning he is seen as one of these young actors, even though he's a little bit older, but that's really a face of this new version of Hollywood that maybe he wouldn't have succeeded in the older version of Hollywood, but this sort of key sort of acting right at the perfect time to sort of burst onto the scene. So the defining role I have to go with is The French Connection of this period from, I'd say, 67 to 71. But now talking about just the actual role of The French Connection, I don't want to talk about it too much just because there's plenty of essays about Popeye Doyle and the film, which is, it still holds up as a very excellent film. But what was interesting to me on rewatch is just how almost irredeemable and sort of unfazed and prickly Popeye Doyle really is. That so much when we think of an actor talking about their character, they're always trying to provide some sort of external understanding or some sympathy or some empathy for their character. Sort of, even if you're playing a villain, you try to understand it from their perspective, try to sort of at least have a little bit of a backstory, and a lot of the great villains do sort of have that, even interwoven within the film. But Popeye Doyle, despite being the lead of this movie, has very sort of few irredeemable factors. He is very disheveled, and especially on this rewatch, it was sort of brave in many ways for Hackman to take on this part of this character who is complicated, yes, but almost irredeemable in many instances in terms of how just broken down of a man he is, that his morals have just become sort of liquid and watery. So he's got this sort of rough exterior facade, but by the end of it, he is just sort of walking into the sort of dark streets, and he is a destroyed, broken man. And there isn't really this sort of sympathetic character arc that maybe a lot of actors would generate and sort of gravitate to. Hackman does it regardless. So I thought it was a fascinating development in that movie. But then going to chapter 2, I'm going to call this chapter The Lost Generation. And really, Gene Hackman, post-1971's The French Connection, has about 15 years, I'd say. Probably I'd cap off this chapter from 71 to 88, where he is a leading man. Now, he's never on the sort of same level of success as The French Connection. Maybe what was promised of him, he didn't necessarily have that great level, in the same way maybe a Dustin Hoffman or Al Pacino or even a Robert Duvall or some of his peers did. Now, that's not to say he did bad films. As many times, he's done very excellent movies. I'm a big fan of Night Moves or Eureka. Certain sort of starring roles that he did within the 70s and the 80s, working with talented directors. But I do think it is telling that from 71 he gets nominated for The French Connection, and his next Oscar nomination is not until 1988. So he's still well respected. He's still great in all these movies, but maybe the movies aren't necessarily capital G great. They're not great hits, but he's getting enough sort of box office and critical acclaim to sort of move him from one project to the next. And critically, I think, always being the lead, that he was never sort of into that supporting factor. There's exceptions to something like Superman, for example, but for the most part, Young Frankenstein, he'll show up as a little bit part, but for the most part, he's doing these leading roles throughout this sort of 70s and 80s period, and not being a huge star, but sort of surviving. And that's why I call it a lost generation, because he's not always seen as sort of that generation of new Hollywood actors, because his films don't always sort of fit into that traditional mold, despite him working with an Arthur Penn or Nicholas Rowe. I mean, he does have this sort of interesting development within the 70s and 80s, almost underrated at this part, but he is sort of finding himself out, and it's not sort of this most celebrated period, I think. That is not until 1986's Hoosiers, in which a movie is sort of a transformative movie for him, a movie that he thought was not going to do very well and was very sort of grumpy and against the movie on set, but despite that became a huge success. And naturally, that's going to be my defining role for this period. And the 71 to 88 range, it really is Gene Hackman as a leading man. Once we get into Mississippi Burning, and after that movie, from then on, we see a lot of sort of co-leads or supporting performances. He never really goes back to the true leading man kind of a role. And I think Hoosiers is a classic true leading man role. Not only is it a great sports movie, and it'll be in the annals of the sports movie Hall of Fames, I do think it's just a sort of traditional great movie. It's a great human drama, and Hackman brings a lot to the movie. That there has these sort of traditional, structured sports movie moments that were a lot of the time were sort of developed and created in this movie, so you have to give it respect there. But the reason why the movie still holds up today is, even though it has this sort of Halloween factor, in the sense that Halloween is a great movie for defining a lot of the horror staples, but now when you watch it, it's a little bit dated, because the horror staples, so there's going to be the guy that goes behind her, and when they open the door, it's going to be the guy right there, so it's a little bit predictable. And in the same way, Hoosiers suffers a little bit from that as a movie, in the sense that it established so many of the sports movie tropes, but now looking back on it, we've seen the sports movie tropes done so many other times in so many other movies that it looks a little bit sort of simplistic. But despite that, the movie still works because of Hackman's performance. That's what he's bringing to the movie. That he adds so much to the drama of the movie, as this guy who sort of is running from his past, from his sort of instances in New York college basketball, and trying to sort of restart his life and his career as a coach of these sort of country Indiana basketball players in a sort of city and a little town that really appreciates basketball, and he's trying to do something different, and he's the outsider, and he just nails so many of the coach dynamics. I mean, if you ever played sports, he does feel like an amalgamation of many different coaches, in that he's inspiring, but he's very strict in one way, but he can also be sort of more sweeter and empathetic in scenes with Dennis Hopper's character or Barbara Hershey's character, and just the fact that this is a great character of a guy who needs another second chance, gets that, and then sort of gives it to Shooter, and then helps elevate and this town and this basketball program. But like I said, it really is sort of the human conflict, the human drama of a guy who is putting everything on his line, as this one last chance that pushes it over the edge. That yes, it's still a great sports movie with the great basketball scenes and the chill moments, but it is Hackman that puts it over the top. So you have to sort of recognize it that in that way. Now going to chapter 3, I'm going to call this one Gene the Great, which is the last chapter where we're going from pretty much 1988 onwards, where he stopped doing these leading man roles and starts doing these co-leading men or supporting roles outright. And then he retires in 2004, so it's this last sort of decade and a bit, this last little 15-year chunk. And it is a shame, we have to end off as Welcome to Mooseport as his final film, but I do think this is actually maybe his best period of time, just because if you look at the movies that he does, where you go, even if you want to go further back, you go 86 Hoosiers, 87 No Way Out, 88 Mississippi Burning, 90 Postcards from the Edge, 92 Unforgiven, 93 The Firm, 94 Wyatt Earp, 95 The Quick and the Dead, Get Shorty, Crimson Tide. And you could even go, 96 The Birdcage, and 98 Enemy of the States, and even if you want to push that a bit, 2001 The Royal Tenenbaums. It's just this great 90s period where he's doing great movie, at least one great movie every single year. All those movies are sort of Connor certified classics, and he really does well here, where there's this sort of formula where if you have Gene Hackman opposite sort of this young actor, that's a formula for success. You have 87 No Way Out, him opposite very young Kevin Costner. 98 Enemy of the State, him opposite a young Will Smith. 93, him opposite a young Tom Cruise. You can even go into, Behind Enemy Lines and Royal Tenenbaums opposite Owen Wilson and Luke Wilson. You can even go Sharon Stone opposite The Quick and the Dead. There's all these instances of Hackman playing opposite this sort of young, up-and-coming actor and going sort of toe-to-toe, going this sort of dual battle, which is, a genre I really like, but a genre that he sort of naturally taps into. And this chapter, because we have this established relationship as Hackman as an old man, when he actually is this sort of older, washed-up man, but still respected veteran, and sort of this great actor, it does sort of play into the success of his role. So when we're watching it in a chronological sort of fashion, he's still, it sort of works in the sense that we see him as and recognize him as an older movie star. So when he's playing these older, more veteran roles, it just sort of adds into the sort of seriousness and the weightness and the believability of the characters he's playing. But when we're talking about this sort of last period in chapter, my favorite sort of actor duel off that he does in this final chapter probably will have to be Crimson Tide. Tony Scott movie, classic, him opposite Denzel Washington. And if you watch him as an actor, what he's able to do in terms of switching the pace and switching the tone and switching the sort of the sides, if you think of the movie truly as a duel, as a competition between the two men, in which the movie is about one belief system versus another without the proper knowledge of either or, and while Denzel is still the sort of main character of the movie, Hackman is able to really sort of take on that challenge and run, that he is the sort of smart, veteran, established naval captain. And if you watch Hackman as he sort of plays these scenes, it's a masterclass in acting, in which he sort of starts off by a little being passive-aggressive to Denzel Washington's sort of questions and his sort of attitudes, and then you see Denzel maybe pushing a little bit too far, and then you see him being a little bit more annoyed, and then you start to see the volcano sort of abrupt and about to sort of explode, and it does explode, and within an instant, this sort of sharp burst staccato way of speaking, he's able to put Denzel in his place and say his position and immediately establish the dominance and power within the scene. And you can see him just doing that in this sort of one little instance, and he does that many times because it's never this sort of one versus one battle throughout the movie. It is a little bit more subtle about that. Denzel does try to come up with him as a sort of a solution positive first attitude, and then sort of gets schooled or Denzel challenges back, and then Hackman goes back at him. It's just a great sort of instance of great dialogue, smart, well-written characters, and that allow the actors to sort of go at each other. And it's a classic of this period, and I know maybe now it's seen as a great movie, and maybe it wasn't back then, but Crimson Tide is a total, absolute classic in my mind, and a lot of the reason has to do with just the seriousness and weight that Hackman brings to that performance. And just briefly before we go into the defining feature of the movie, I do want to mention that Hackman is a great comedic presence. That he really didn't fit in any of the chapters, but when you think of his part in Young Frankenstein or Superman or The Royal Tenenbaums or The Birdcage, this guy is a classic comedic sort of star. Get Shorty even. Throughout the sort of his career, he sprinkles in these great comedic roles, and for as much of it's great to see the sort of classic, mature serious weightiness that he brings, it's also really fun to see that sort of weightiness be undercut and him being a little bit more silly, a little bit more goofy, which he is excellent at doing that, which is why his defining feature is the veteran. Because in my mind, that plays in two different ways. On one hand, it's a descriptor of him as an actor. He's a veteran. He's seen as this older guy. He's never seen as this young buck. He's always the sort of old, established actor, no business, no sort of playing around, all business kind of a guy. And that's what we've seen as an actor in general. But he's also playing oftentimes these veteran roles because he started acting so late. So when he's in his 60s, he's sort of at the peak of his movie stardom, and he's playing a lot of these roles in which he's the sort of older veteran man. In Crimson Tide, he's sort of the established person in the firm. He's the sort of established older law firm owner. He's played the president twice. He's always put in these positions of veteran, established, maturity, wisdom positions. And even when he's younger, when we have a movie like Night Moves, he's a washed-up actor. French Connection is a disenfranchised cop. It's not a young, bright-eyed Serpico cop. It is a disenfranchised cop. He's the veteran. He's the past his prime kind of an actor. And Hackman, with his sort of disheveled and always tired and done with it kind of an attitude, works so well with that. And then if you add in the meta element of it, the fact that this guy is seen as a veteran actor, when we put him in a movie like The Firm with an up-and-coming actor and an older actor, Tom Cruise and Gene Hackman, and when they're playing characters of an up-and-coming lawyer and an established lawyer, it just adds so much to the meta element of the movie in the sense that it adds to the drama, because we're bringing our own baggage, our understanding of them as movie stars, we're bringing that to the movie, and Hackman totally is utilizing that in this later period. He's great because he's getting these great characters, but also his performances just make more sense. He's always been great. He's always great in these sort of lesser movies in the sort of 70s and 80s, which are still good, but he does sort of, not always the classics that we see, I think, in the 90s. But he's just a guy that seems like he's been through it. The balding head, the wrinkles, the sort of tired, frustrated look. Hackman is an expert at that. He's a movie star. Because of that, that is his magic. And because of his established movie star career, by the time we get to the 90s and he's playing established professionals, it just makes all more sense because we believe him as an established actor, because that's what he is. So it ties into it together, and just his ability to bring a seriousness, a weight, but also do comedy. He can also do comedy and undercut himself there, but for the most part, being serious, having that weight, having that seriousness, brings so much authenticity to his roles and blow me away all the time. He's got impeccable taste, as I've mentioned, particularly in the 90s kind of period there. He can do it all. In my opinion, he's one of the greatest actors of all time. He can be kind of an everyman, but is still his own sort of Gene Hackman kind of persona. Old, mature, wise, seriousness, weighty. A legendary actor, in my opinion, and one of the greatest actors of all time. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Gene Hackman. And until next time, stay tuned.